You're listening to the Around the Lens podcast, the home of high-quality, roundtable, visual journalism discussion about the news, topics, and gear related to our career field. Now, here's the host of our show, David J. Murphy.
Hello and welcome to episode 230 of Around the Lens. I'm your host, David J. Murphy. Joining me this week are my co-host, Zach Roberts, a photojournalist based out of New York State. Hello, Zach. How are you?
I'm alive. How you doing?
Not bad. Our guest this week is Tara Pixley. She is a PhD in photojournalism and a photojournalist herself, also teaching the craft. Tara, how are you?
Doing well, thanks. Thanks so much for having me on,
now,
David.
I don't think my reading of your title was adequate. I want to know from you, can you tell us a little more about your background and your career?
Yes, absolutely. So I have a 20-year career in visual journalism, working as a photojournalist, a writer, a photo editor for Newsweek, CNN, Creative Loafing, and Alternative News Weekly in Atlanta. And I have a PhD in communication, actually, from UC San Diego. But my emphasis in my PhD was studying visual journalism and trying to sort of understand how to connect all of the scholarship around visual culture and critical race theory and media studies to the work that we do in the field as visual journalists. So I now am a professor of journalism. I teach photography and video and media production and also critical and ethical issues in journalism at Loyola Marymount University. And I am also an independent visual journalist and one of the co-founders and board members of Authority Collective, which is an organization that produces resources, builds community, and helps the sort of communities of women, non-binary, and trans photographers of color in the various visual media industries.
Cool. Well,
that is my long-winded introduction of my work.
I think that does much more justice than my little rinky-dink introduction. So, good. Glad to have you. We got a lot of great topics to talk about today, and we don't have too much time to talk about them because we got a couple people who are going to turn into pumpkins and have to get out of here. So let's just get started. Our first topic this week is about the protests. So they've been going on for quite a while now. Besides the Occupy protests, I can't think of a longer string or series of protests or extended amount of protests on a specific topic. I could be wrong. Somebody could enlighten me if they know better. But, again, this has been going on for quite a while. And I kind of, for those of you who are covering it, because I know you guys, I've seen your work. I know you've been out there, Zach and Tara, you've both been covering it. Does there come a point where you get a fatigue with the subject of protests? And if you do, how do you sort of counteract that, and how do you kind of cover a protest day in and day out and take it from different angles? We'll start, of course, as always, with our guest. Whenever we have a new guest on the show, we always go to them first. So Tara, kind of talk to me a little bit about your sort of experience with the protests and sort of how you have covered it over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's actually a really great question. I wonder if photojournalists experience that level of fatigue on any of the subjects that we tend to cover, because so many of us sort of specialize. But I think certainly my answer for this, and I imagine a potential answer for many photojournalists, would be that every movement develops and evolves over time. And so I first went out to photograph the protests here in LA on May 30th. And the last protest I covered, I've done 4 or 5 over the last several weeks, and I kind of took this week off to focus on other projects they needed to get done. I saw a very radical shift in the kind of tenor and approach to the protests. So I certainly didn't feel fatigued. It felt different every time. I will say that a few of the protests that I went to were in the same area. And so that was a little just sort of like visually disinteresting for me. And I was very cognizant of trying to have, how to work a diversity of like visual perspectives into the images so that it doesn't kind of have the same kind of symbols, like of the surrounding area and things like that. So really trying to sort of push myself to work beyond the like limits of this particular environment was the thing that I was struggling with. But generally, I would say that covering the protests has just continued to be an incredible experience. It's the civil rights movement of our time, certainly of my time, and seeing how extensive and how consistent people have been it's really remarkable. I think as an American citizen, I feel that way, and as a journalist, I feel privileged to be able to cover this moment.
Let's go to you, Zach. How have you been? Obviously you've been covering this for quite a while, and kind of talk to us about your experience with this and where you're at now.
Yeah, I've been lucky enough to be able to cover it in 3 different cities. I was in Minneapolis. I was then went to DC. Then I went to Richmond, Virginia, which might be heading back there again soon. But it's certainly the crowd every day in Minneapolis was a different day because even within Minneapolis, there was like 3 or 4 different spots that people would convene. One would be the place where George Floyd was murdered. Another place would be where that famous Target was burnt. And basically wherever police would start to gather, then counter protests. I often now have started considering police doing their own protest, and that people are actually now just counter protesting police at this point, considering they've decided to start most of the violence that has happened. I just watched this fantastic New York Times investigation onto the terrible cornering of a bunch of protesters along a highway, and where they tear gassed and pepper sprayed and then beat them and shot them with pepper. It's incredible. I highly recommend it. I think it should be on their front page right now. But so every day has been different. DC was mostly in the same area, in the area in front of the White House, and it was interesting to watch, kind of step back. I didn't take as many photos at the DC event, even though there was a large number of people, mainly because it was more interesting to watch the interactions and kind of wait for moments to happen as they laid out. Like, I happened to see all of when they painted Black Lives Matter across the road. After that, I was able to actually watch it slowly take place when the activists there added defund the police. So Black Lives Matter equals defund the police, and watch people walk in with paint rollers, people walk in with whatever, and I kind of documented that. I think I put together a piece on vsu.news about it. But then in Richmond, Virginia, it was, at least what I was covering was mainly in the one spot around the Robert E. Lee Monument. And so there, since when I was there wasn't the huge number of peoples. It was a couple quiet days. I decided to kind of take a different approach, in that I did like some time lapses of people moving around, people spray painting, people covering things, and then also kind of try to talk to people a lot more, usually off camera, because more and more people are becoming concerned about police using the photos that we take of people and the videos and so on, using them to arrest them, pull them around later on. And I did witness some people committing criminal acts. Like, I'm working on a piece right now about them literally chiseling away at the monument, at the base of the monument. I actually have a couple pieces of it. I'm a strong proponent of pulling down Confederate monuments. I won't hide that. So, which is, I guess, down. Probably no surprise to anyone. Yes, but yes, I mean, it's been, luckily, like, I spent like 3 days at each one of the places, and it's been like a long enough time to kind of like get into it, but then refresh and kind of go to a different story. Back during Occupy Wall Street, I remember I did get somewhat bored during at least the early days, because it was mainly the same couple, like 200 people or so before kind of numbers really gained. And it's like, there's a certain point when there's only so many times you can take photos and video of people, playing drums and talking about the same issues. And, and literally I probably have a photo of almost every person that was there at a certain point, because I was covering it every single night for weeks. But I find now, especially now that I'm kind of okay with trying out different things, and trying to be maybe a little bit more artistic with the work, as opposed to like I'm only covering something if it's happening, like maybe trying doing portraits or other things like that might bring it along.
Cool.
So
Cool. Yeah, so that's interesting because it's like, you get the typical protest shots, right? The people in large groups chanting and cheering and advocating for their cause, and then it's like you have to now figure out different aspects and ways to cover that. Did you take that same approach when you were covering Occupy?
It's interesting now because I've allowed not to some extent, towards the later days and weeks of the after weeks, I started being like, okay, I'm going to sit down and spend some time and interview these people and talk to them and try to take like a genuine portrait, be like, moving them maybe a little bit so the background is the correct, if the light's right or something like that, as opposed to most of the time if I do a quote unquote portrait, just using my 35 millimeter lens at 1.4, like super basic and moving along and not really discussing too much. But the past couple of years I've been working, mainly shooting for wire service. And so you get into this kind of rut of shooting for what they want, what is going to sell. So doing things like, you'd still take the photo of the sign that has a swear word on it, but that they're not going to, no one's going to use that. Which is to me ridiculous.
Yeah.
I literally watched a news report while I was there of local news where they blurred out the statue. They blurred out the entirety of the graffiti because they did the interview of actually a person I know in front of the statue, but it has swear words on it. So they literally pixelated the entire background out, and it was local news. And it was just like, I can't believe we're really at this. Like, we're okay with showing George Floyd getting murdered on loop, but having a swear word on the screen in the background, like briefly, as a part of a news story, is not okay. Like, this idea that, like, we were joking off
our morals are all confused in this country. We got a real morality problem.
It's one of that story is one of those things that was like running through my head, and like we won't delve into this this week, but like about the Bill of Rights and the photo Bill of Rights that's out there that's kind of within our community being discussed very passionately. And I just think about like the number of problems that are so much bigger than some words of a document that is completely advisory and completely voluntarily. And it's just like, massive police violence. I got pepper sprayed in the face, hit with tear gas and hit with thing, and it's just like, we're not going to really get involved in that, but oh my God, words on a screen.
Well, those are the words of the Bill of Rights is like, it's meant to protect photojournalists. It's meant to like make the industry a better place and to force the powers that be to kind of consider how especially freelance photographers in crises like the ongoing pandemic and now this protest movement, how are we negatively affected by that in so many different ways, financially, physically? I worked on a visual storytellers field survey with Martin Smith-Broaden, my wonderful collaborator at Ball State University, and he's a former photo editor and visual journalist who got his PhD in psychology and now looks at the kind of psychological ramifications of working in journalism and mental health issues around visual journalists, etc. So he and I worked with Cashlight to put out this survey, and we got over 700 responses from visual storytellers, primarily independent visual journalists working in the field during COVID. And the stuff that we were hearing is heartbreaking. People are not able to support their families. People are not able to like do the kind of work that they need to do because they're not getting the support that they need from the big news organizations and these various, like I could tell you some of the appalling offers I've gotten from major magazines and newspapers to publish photos for $50, $150, or I'm, busting my ass sending in images at 2 a.m. because they asked for it on deadline. I don't hear back from them for 3 days. And then they say, oh, we did it. We went in a different direction, or, we can give you $75 to publish this online. It's just, it's absurd, right? So like I have 2 children. I live in Los Angeles. I can't live off of your $75 for my time. So like the Bill of Rights is really trying to help bring attention to those issues, that not everyone who works in photojournalism is is a wealthy person whose parents have supported them or who left them a bunch of generational wealth to live off of and just pull in, 20K while they travel the world doing conflict photography. That's not everyone's life. So we need to think more, critically about how do we support the visual journalists who are trying to bring attention to the most important issues of our time and tell local stories.
Like you said, I mean, the problem is there are people who are willing to take those lowball offers for their work because, again, they either are perhaps someone who cares more about exposure or more about being published than they do about making a living, or again they have that sort of nice little padding that they can fall back on if they don't make a lot of money. We've seen that again and again where people who either give their work away for free or don't charge nearly what they should. And as I'll tell anybody who might be curious about this, like, charge something for your work. Even if you don't think you're worth what you should be paid, which is far more than what they pay you, charge something. Don't ever give away your work for free, especially not to like a corporation, for God's sakes.
Well, and this is something I always add is that, because I mean, there's so often the only way that especially, I'm just using for pure example, the New York Times, like a publication that actually has money to spend on journalism and should and would actually pay for things, is the fact that one of the only ways that you actually get a lot of these places to respect you is by charging, and they will respect your work because they paid for it. And so they won't just like slapdash put it up there or just use it in a less than respectful way or something like that. And and the fact that like I actually spend a lot of time on Twitter. I spend a lot of time on Twitter just in general, but spend a lot of time on Twitter. Anytime you see somebody posting a video and then right underneath it there's the vultures of journalism jumping in there and be like, hey, can we use this for local news for in perpetuity and whatever? And I'm like, just charge $150. That's it. Like, just do that. If they won't do it, then they don't get it. And then one of their one of the local news stations will pay the money, and then they'll make sure that you get the right credit. They'll make sure that you have a right then to kind of have a say in the conversation of how it's being used. Like, that's something that I learned over the last couple years, is that like there's a reason why contracts are really good to have, even if it is just a very brief email discussion, not an official contract. It's nice to have that, because then you can at least, oh wait a minute, like, you're using it in this way. No, you don't get to use it later on.
And I really don't think that enough conversations are happening with young photojournalists before they get into the field. Like, it's all about like, this is how you take a good picture and this is how you write a good caption and AP style and get an internship. But where are the conversations around these are extractive practices? You need to think about that critically. How do you engage with the sources and communities that you're photographing, and how do you protect yourself as you're getting contracts, but potentially as an independent photographer? And I remember my first job out of J school, I was working as a full-time photojournalist at the Greenville News. And while at the time I was like, this is amazing, a salary, right? It's my first salary. I'm so excited. The amount of work that I did far exceeded that salary, which I was so happy to get. And I didn't negotiate at all. It didn't even occur to me to negotiate. No one never told me that I had the right to negotiate. And then, you end up just taking these jobs, whether you're staff or independent, and you don't have the kind of knowledge or resources to speak to those power structures that you're trying so hard to get into. It's like when the New York Times asks you to do something, you don't say, I don't think that's a fair rate, New York Times, when you're 22 years old. You say, thank God the New York Times knows my name. You're
like, oh my God, the New York Times wants to publish my work.
Right, well, exactly.
I'm a proponent of the at least the $15 minimum wage. And sometimes, because a lot of times you talk to people about our day rates and things like that, or what we got paid for an assignment. People go, you got paid $450 for an assignment? And it's like, well, wait a minute. So I drove 6 hours to get there. I drove 6 hours back. I paid for a hotel room. I did this. I'm like, I made $175 from this assignment. Like, oh, and also I worked. So you take everything. I worked 24 hours. So I made less than minimum wage. less than the federal minimum wage. And I think that most photojournalists probably work in that world, even like better paid ones when, you know, it's like talk about like $600 day, you know, like the bigger day rates, because of all the other work that you have to put in before you get that one day of work per, you know, every couple weeks, maybe, if you're lucky, if you get a, you know, day rates exist these days, you know. But
and who is telling young photographers who are new to the industry, do they understand how they're going to get totally screwed over by taxes? Like, are they putting aside?
Don't worry, they won't make enough to ever actually have to pay taxes, because they'll be below the poverty line.
Oh, on prayer.
Yeah, but they have to.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, but you have to make so little. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. So it's just, you know, these are the things, like a lot of the stuff, frankly, are things that are trying to be addressed in the Bill of Rights, things that we saw coming up in that field survey, and conversations I've been having with colleagues for years and years and years. You know, I was definitely that kid who was so excited to be in the industry and just wanted to learn everything and took every critique as like the end of my like sense of self. And all, you know, years later, I'm just like, oh man, I got to help the next generation not have that same experience. Let me talk to you about contract law. Let me talk to you about your copyrights. Let me talk to you about negotiating your rates and your fees. And it's just so much more than, you know, not working for free, which is a very important thing to tell everyone. Like, even if you don't need the money, don't work for free, because someone who needs the money needs the industry to understand that no one works for free. And if you do it, then they're going to say, why, I got this guy who had all this great work to work for free. How dare you think that you should get paid? You know, and it's ridiculous. We're journalists, we're storytellers, we're trying to do a service here. And it just is getting devalued in so many ways. And from inside the industry, you know, I hear so much talk about how the lack of public trust in media, and well, we're doing that to ourselves. It's not happening just because of nonsense that politicians say. Politicians have been speaking nonsense about the news media for a very long time. We are actually losing, I think, public trust in us because of our own actions. Our standards are getting lowered because of the digital realm. We're trying to do things too quickly. We're getting things wrong. We're not considering how the work that we do might affect the people that we're speaking about. We just aren't doing the bare minimum of what our publics and our audiences need. And that's why they're losing trust in us. And I think that's really, really important for visual journalists to think about.
I was going to say on that note, is business law, or not business law, but is sort of the economics and business of our job something that is part of the fundamental courses for photojournalists now in terms of what, you know, or is that just basically you teaching it because you want to teach it? Or has it been more, I would say, prevalent throughout education?
You know, I can certainly say that I was not taught that, but I have been out of undergrad for a very long time. And now that I'm teaching in a journalism program, we say that we're platform agnostic and we're very digital focused. So we're extremely expansive in the approaches that we're teaching to our journalists, but we don't really have a business of journalism class in our department. As we grow, we're a relatively new journalism program. So as we grow, that's absolutely something that I'm going to advocate for and push. And that is something I do teach to my photography students. I think that every journalism program should have that alongside. I've often taught, I've taught at the community college level and also at art institutes of photography. And we often have a portfolio class where you're talking about your digital presence. What do you put on your website and social media? But in my experience, again, this is limited. There's less attention paid to the importance of understanding budgeting and contracts and invoicing and things like that. Luckily, we have organizations like NPPA, ASMP, PPA that help kind of give that knowledge, but you have to pay for those things. And a lot of students and emerging photographers can't afford that. It was years before I could afford those memberships. And it's still, every time I go to sign up again, I'm like, oh, already it's been a year. Damn. You know, it's just, all these fees going out to these organizations. Again, I appreciate the work that they do, but it's a hit if you're a freelance.
What would you say, or where would you turn those people who may not know what their product is worth to? Like, is there a calculator or something online that you would recommend? Like, if I'm just trying to do this job, I haven't been in business classes, I don't know how to charge for my work. Where would you send me, and how would you determine I price myself?
Well, like I mentioned, ASMP, and I believe NPPA has some stuff like this as well, offers a lot of really good things for budgeting and considering contracts, especially putting together a bid for mostly commercial work. I think that there's a lot more support for commercial photography and figuring that stuff out than there is for photojournalists. Like, I actually think that there's a kind of lack of that space in professionalizing photojournalists and thinking of the sort of all the angles of what that work looks like, which is interesting because it's one of the most poorly paid photography, so it's like, that's cool that I can go and find out how to do $100,000 bid for Nike or, whatever. And definitely, having done bids like that, or, put together bids like that, it's very helpful to have a frame of reference. But even just the basics of writing an invoice to, you don't have to invoice the New York Times, so they have a handy dandy internal thing. Thanks, New York Times. But writing invoices to all of these other organizations, I don't know where to send people to learn about that. They should definitely read a photo editor. I think that's a great resource that's been around for a long time and something that I've used across various, at various levels in my professional career. And what would you say, Zach? What has been your experience with photo to find that information?
First off, follow Todd Bigelow. He is a photojournalist who also does the business of photography classes. I sat in on one of his things at the short course in New Jersey. It was 2 years ago, last year. I have no idea. Sense of time is gone. But he definitely a good person to follow. Business of Photography, I think it's called, is a photo group that basically, is it Photo Business Sense? I think it's Photo Business Sense, each separate word. It's a you have to ask it in, but I don't see it, as long as you have proof that you're basically to some level of photojournalist. If somebody checks, you get in. And what I see a lot of people do is basically go like, hey, I just got this assignment, never, kind of like give a short thing, and then people will, mostly people who have pretty good experience in the field, will be like, okay, well, don't ask for less than this, don't do this, and nobody gives specifics because no one, unfortunately, in this industry does that. Is gonna give me like, okay, well, here's what I got from them last time. They'll give generalities, which will help, or sometimes you'll go into direct messages and kind of talk off there. There's also a couple pieces of software called Photo Biz. With an F-O-T-O Biz, Photo Quote. Basically, it will give you industry standard pricing photography. The other one will give you base contract info, and so it'll give you a template on what to send them if they're asking for a contract. And the last big thing is. The last big one is basically, the rough idea is that if you're like the New York Times or somebody, or a book, go to Getty. Getty's like journalism side, and then find a similar photo that you're doing, that you're doing, and you can actually you can work out what would Getty charge, and then basically you can kind of go off of that. And obviously Getty, it will charge a good amount of money or whatever, especially if it's like a commercial use or something like that. But then you can be like, okay, so here's what, if they were going to buy a photo from the big photo source Getty, this is what they charge, and then you can decide from there whether you just go straight out there. I've never had any luck being like, well, this basically asking for what Getty's charging, but I can go, okay, well, I know it's if it's a cover of a book or something in a book, if somebody asks me that, I know that that doesn't equate to my. What if a newspaper is asking? Like, what if a local newspaper is asking? That's, I'm just making up numbers here, $250, you can use it. A cover of a book should be 800, and depending on, because Getty also, you can go through the whole thing and be like, is it international use? Is it only US? Is it TV broadcast, all the different options if it's going to be used in a documentary and so on. And so that's helped a lot with that. But the biggest resource, honestly, has been different Facebook groups that I've either just followed and kind of paid attention to, or sometimes myself asked, like, directly. Like, that's the other thing too, is don't hesitate. If you have build relationships, I think is one of the biggest ways. I never went to J school, never went to, I have a political science major. So I have nothing related to, never even, I took, I think 2 weeks of journalism classes in my entire life. So I never had any of the connections, but like the biggest things that has been able to help me is just making those little connections. I have a bunch of friends made from NPPA, made from, just being out on the street and talking to people. And if I know that they've worked for a publication that is now asking me for it, I'll go, hey, I'm thinking about charging this much money to them with this thing. Do you think that's a good idea? And most, like I have close friends that'll be like, charge this much. Like, just be like, you have to charge this. Like, I'm really honest with everybody. I'm like, look, this is how much I charged. I think you can charge more, or, and that sort of thing. So, I mean, like, that's one of the biggest things is like make friends as quick as possible that are willing to, talk amongst yourselves is one of the most important things and that's something that's unfortunately really kind of, it's always feels like frowned upon within the freelance industry. Because I mean, like, there's a website for writers, if you're a journalist, called Who Pays Writers. It started out as just a Tumblr, and then it turned into a full database of people who be like, okay, well, I'm going to work for the Jacobin. What do they normally charge? And it's this, this couple of cents per word is what they'll pay. And then you can figure out things from like that. I think that there's another one that's Who Pays Photographers that you can go through, and it kind of gives things like, here's how long they're going to take to pay you. Here's, how responsive they are with different things. Because, I mean, there's always the other important things. Like, if somebody's going to pay me in less than 2 weeks, I know that shouldn't be that way, but like my rate is always a little bit more flexible. That's not an issue. If because I'm like $500 now is just as useful as $700 in sometime in the future. So, but but those are always things you got to kind of consider if you're working for a place more than just once out of the blue when they buy your photos. But yeah, that's a really long answer.
I'll advocate on the Getty or the AP or any of those definitely those picture houses, the ones that publish and have their calculators, use those as a good litmus. And then, of course, you have to take into consideration the publication or the entity that wants your imagery. Obviously, a smaller company might not have as much of funds or resources to pay you as much versus perhaps like the national news or an international entity. But I would also say don't lowball yourself. Don't undermine your own work, and especially look at what you have. If you have something that is like exclusive, or if you have something that's very sought after, don't be afraid to charge more than you think it's worth. Because I think another issue we have a lot in this industry is people don't think that they don't value their own content as much as it should be, or as much as what it really is worth. And you have to consider, for the larger companies, they have a large budget to afford to pay for, whether it's video or photo, they have a budget for that. So definitely don't lowball yourself. And if you have something that's extremely exclusive or highly sought after, pit the companies against themselves. Create a bidding war around your work. When I worked as a photographer for a photo agency in New York City, that's what we would do. If I had something exclusive, you would go to one magazine or publication and say, hey, I have this. How much would you like for it? And then you go to the other publication and say, hey, I've got this. I'm being offered this. Will you offer me more? It's again, if you have that kind of content, you have that luxury of time, then that's kind of one way you can get more for your work. You were going to say something, Tara?
The luxury of time.
Well, if you don't have,
what is that?
If you have an agent, your agent can do that for you. But obviously, then you're paying for your agent to do that, and then you have a cut between you and your agent. And it's just like,
there's the rub.
Indeed.
The cost of the agent. I was just going to follow up with what Zach was saying, that the Who Pays Photographers Tumblr, I don't believe it's been updated since 2018. I just checked it again. I hadn't looked at it in a really long time. Yeah, it looks like 2018 was the last update there. Obviously, Tumblr. Goodbye, Tumblr. But there are also a lot of kind of databases I've seen produced by certain groups that you can look at that together if you are part of that group, which isn't, publicly available. So I think that we need to have a lot more publicly available information around rates, and just there's no reasonable or like rational reason for why newsrooms can't just say, this is my day rate. It's 600, it's 450 plus mileage. So much of that is consistent. The thing I wonder sometimes is, are they actually making, like, are some photographers getting paid more based off of who knows what, like, reasoning? Why don't they want to just make that plain? And the more secretive things like that are, the more possible it is for infringement on rights and overstepping the kind of ethical boundaries within the organization itself. So I think that clarity and transparency should be, that is what journalism is supposed to be, right? So why are we hiding and being so not transparent about the rates that photojournalists are making, or that independent writers are making? We shouldn't have to beg for that information, and we shouldn't have to wait for it to be brought up. This is the thing I hate, when I'm getting assigned from a new organization and they ask me everything, my availability, like basically the job's booked, and then I have to say, but what is your rate? I shouldn't have to actually do that. You should be offering that rate up front. It should be part of the ask. And I do get emails like that, which I deeply appreciate. Thank you for all of this information, including how much you're going to pay me for my time and my expertise. Awesome. I appreciate it. You would probably want that, right? Like, as a professional, everybody wants that. So why can't this just be kind of the standard? I actually wanted to circle back to the photographic protest thing. Zach, I only photographed a little bit of the Occupy protest. I was in Atlanta at the time, and they had a kind of small, I would say, gathering of folks for that particular intervention. So I'm curious, as someone who, you mentioned earlier that you've made a career out of photographing activists, did these protests feel different to you? Like, what has been your experience around this particular protest movement, especially across the 3 cities? Because I ask because I felt that the protests, especially early on, felt incredibly different than any protest I'd ever attended or covered. So I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
I mean, definitely. I covered Ferguson as well, so there was some similarities there, but Ferguson felt very different. I think one of the big things is that it's not like 80% white. That's one of the biggest things. Like, you cover like what, the large organized, things like the March for Science and the Women's March or whatever. You go to these, and it's like just a sea of whiteness. And that's part of privilege. That's part of being able to have a day off, being able to go and cover this, be part of a protest, especially being potentially arrested or having, fines or whatever. That's a big reason why, that's been a thing. Occupy, even in New York City, was, I would say, 75% white. And I think that has the tenor of the type of protest it was a little bit. But like, seeing this is the fact that it has been, while it is definitely focused on police violence and the general idea of like around Black Lives Matter, it has been like fantastically diverse, like ages, age, race, everything across the board, and the lack of, I'm trying to figure out how to say it. Unlike Occupy, where it was a quote unquote leaderless movement, even though there was leaders and organizers and things like that, this seems to genuinely be a lot more leaderless, but still like decisions are made as they moved along. That's very much in Minneapolis. Like, there didn't seem to be any like one person that was like, okay, we're going left, we're going right, we're going whatever. Decisions were quickly made, and then kind of and it allowed the protesters to respond to the actions of police, and which were continually changing and evolving, and the kind of leadership, or the kind of like what the mayor was saying or the governor was saying about what was going to happen to the protests or how the response was, it was able to evolve very quickly. And I think it allowed it to not just be because one of the big things I always really worry about is that there's a big day, whether it be, there's, riots, again, not using the term riots in a negative or positive sense, just, the description of it, like happening. And then the next day, there might be a big protest, and then after that, it dies right out. Like, there's going to be numbers. This continued on, and I think that had to do a lot with the fact that there was a large number of people who, from all different walks of life and kind of different ways of activism. There's definitely a lot of people who were there. This is their first time ever being an activist, and then I could tell, you can always just spot them and you're like, okay, this is what their life is like. this is Antifa in quotes, like this guy or woman or person or whatever, like this person does this, like this is they work a job and then they spend the nights doing this and that sort of thing. And the one thing that that kind of brings every protest together though was I was kind of worried because I heard so many responses, especially from New York City photographers, about how activists were responding to photographers, specifically, but journalists as well, print journalists as well. But I actually found that they saved my butt. I got pepper sprayed in the face, and then they pulled me back, like to help me and to get me out of the area, because the police were immediately responding with rubber bullets and shooting above our heads, which is not only illegal but incredibly dangerous. We had a photographer colleague of our, Linda, lost her eye because at that same evening, actually, they shot her straight in the face. But the protesters were very, very helpful to not just make moments, which is not something I'm a fan of, but helpful to make sure that like we were part of the not just part of the moment, but also just being safe and continuing to be able to do our job. Offering water once I got pepper sprayed, I ended up getting a car ride from two activists out of the area because the police were shooting tear gas in the area. And so like I ended up finding like everyone was there's occasional people, like even I had a person dressed as a medic, like an anti-fascist, again, in quotes for people who are just listening, anti-fascist medic, like dressed up like that. He took a swing at me and another photojournalist and was yelling at us to stop taking photos, even though we weren't taking photos of him. But he was immediately swarmed by protesters who said no and protected us again. And so like, I know that this happens, my West Coast photojournalist friends will say there's a lot of, activists that will, use physical force to get photojournalists out of an area. But like, I never had that experience whatsoever in 3 different cities and was completely welcomed. And that I think was one of the biggest things that I noticed is that people, I think that there's a couple different groups like within this activist movement. There's obviously the people that are worried about photojournalists, and I totally understand that when it comes to like legal repercussions and that sort of thing. But the big one is I think that there's enough people out there that realize that our photos, whether or not we just put them up there as a news source and upload them to a wire service or whatever, but our photos are the way the rest of the country is seeing what's happening on the ground, and that can protect them and also be helpful to them. And so I think that that's something to realize, that I think that with Occupy, that took a long time. Like I got arrested and beat up at Occupy, and even had like tried to talk to them and like, look, you have to like respect photojournalists, because we're the ones that when your photos come out, those are the moments that change how Occupy was viewed by the rest of the country. And so I think that people, obviously you have a lot more media savvy, I think just the youths of the activism, like they understand the media better than I think even a lot of photojournalists do. But I think that they understand it better than even some of the old guard, because even Occupy had a older guard with them of activists, like from the, they were still like from the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, like they were still around. at Occupy, but now those people aren't at least taking kind of like leadership roles or kind of that sort of thing, and they're led by literally people that I'm pretty sure the handful of conversations I had have never actually been involved in activism before, at least in any large sense, and like as we're seeing now across the country still. That makes sense.
Yeah, I think all of those are really great points. And the thing is that I think that protesters and just people, the public in general, responds to the way that you are approaching them and speaking to them and photographing them. You know, if you're being aggressive or rude or a lot of times, this has happened to me actually 3 or 4 times just in the last few weeks of photographing protests. Certain photojournalists don't interpret me as a professional photojournalist. You can imagine why. And they push me out of the way, stand in front of me, things like that. I just photograph them doing those things, and kind of file it away. But when the public sees photographers acting that way, as if they, have more right to be in certain places than others, as if they don't have respect for the people they're photographing, I think those are the people who draw the ire of some people. And so it's not that everyone respects photojournalists or people don't. I think it really has a lot to do with how we comport ourselves in front of people. And if we're being respectful and thoughtful, then I've never really had any issues with. I've experienced a lot more aggression from my colleagues in the field than I ever have from people I'm photographing.
Well, I think we're gonna lose Zach, right? Or Zach, can you stay on longer? Do you have to? Okay, great.
10 more minutes.
I just want to get your thoughts on this other topic here about Fox. So Fox News, of course, the bastion of free press in the world, right? Anyways, they got caught manipulating some imagery that they used from the Seattle protests, essentially to illustrate a photo. They create a photo illustration with, they took 3 photos and manipulated them together. And, photo illustration is a thing. It exists. You can do it in certain contexts for certain projects and certain things, but it has to be clearly denoted that that's what you're doing. And it has to be, very specifically used for specific circumstances. And in this case, there was no denotion that this was a manipulated image. So they went back and they corrected that, but they still, again, this is a national news organization that's, representing this imagery and this story in this way. So, again, I'll throw it out to you, Zach, first, since we'll lose you sooner. But, how did something like this happen? Is it just because it's Fox News, or is it because perhaps there's a lack of knowledge and stuff about the efficacy of using photographs in stories?
I mean, I highly doubt that they, at this point, even have a photo editing staff. I mean, this is, I think it speaks to a larger issue, and the fact that this is a problem where you don't have I mean, even the last days of me working at the Village Voice as a freelancer, we never had a photo editor. It was a visuals editor or an art editor or something like that. And so luckily with the Voice, everyone that I had was trained as a photo editor, and so it would just happen to be their title. But a lot of other publications, I've said, I think I've worked with a total of 4 photo editors in my entire career of 15 years working as a photojournalist. And obviously I work for a lot of smaller sites and things like that, so it's not always going to become a thing. But one of the problems is that ethically they don't know what what you're supposed to do. And yes, I've had a ton of my photos, especially from Charlottesville, used in photo illustrations, and they're always distinctly used as photo. It will say photo illustration on the bottom, but it also it's art. It's not really photojournalism. It's 3 photos, or maybe they'll up the contrast and whatever. And usually it will never just be my credit below it. I would have a problem with that as a photojournalist if somebody changed my work that much. A crop is somewhat okay, even though, again, as somebody pointed out, assuming they got these photos from, I think they got those photos from Getty, they have in their guidelines that they broke their guidelines. So this person, whoever put this together, didn't even read guidelines, which isn't necessarily surprising again. I mean, on the I guess either more macro or whatever issue, I mean, I think that we have to kind of give up on the idea that Fox News is news. I mean, that
who held that idea still? I did only.
I find it, I mean, obviously local, I feel bad for the local, like there are a lot of great local reporters working for Fox News or Fox. But like the news entity that is Fox News National is not a news organization, doesn't attempt to be. And honestly, like with all this discussion we've had about MPPA guidelines and code of ethics and everything like that we've been having, I was just like, really? Because this was a big argument again within like photo groups that I'm in. We were talking about this, and everyone kind of had the same sense. We're like, really, Fox News? And I'm like, yet they're still allowed in the MPPA. Like, I mean, like there is a certain point where we have to go, you're breaking all these guidelines. I don't know as a news organization, if you're a full-time staffer or whatever there, that you should be allowed in journalistic organizations. Like, I think that like, that's to me, the only way that it might change is if you actually if you're a reporter who really wants to, do good journalism and you get that first job at Fox, like, I know I have a lot of friends that was their first job, is they got an internship or got like a assistant producer job or something like that, and then they move on and they use it as a jumping place to get to a better news organization. But I think that I think at some point we have to start, because it's not just like one-off examples. I mean, ABC, CBS, NBC, MSNBC, all these places have like one-off examples every couple months or every couple years or whatever, that they have like a really big problem. And they get publicly shamed and kind of move on. But like Fox, it's like every other day. Like if you just watch their news, not their commentary, which they delineate in legally, I think, but like, that no one watching them delineates. I mean, nobody pays attention whether it's John Roberts or whether it's related. John Roberts is not Fox, but like their quote unquote news side of things or their nightly hate fest that they have, the Tucker Carlson White Power Hour and everything like that. I mean, it's just like they don't differentiate it in their news program or way that they show things. And like, I think at a certain point that we need to, as other journalists, need to start differentiating it. And I personally, I won't sell to them. Or if I do, I go, here's a huge amount of money. You want this photo? I know what you're going to do with this video.
$5,000 for one image.
I have done that. They wanted a Black Lives Matter video of people marching through Macy's a couple years ago, and I said $800, which is it's like normally it would be like 400 or something like that. I'm like, no. I have I know that this probably defeats some ethical guidelines, but I have an FU rate. If for certain,
I don't think that
things.
Is any unethical guideline at all.
This is capitalism. To me, that's capitalism. I get to charge what I want with everybody, and they can choose not to buy it or buy it. So anyway,
and nothing is more capitalistic than Fox News in this, at least in this realm. There's something else I want to point out about this particular debacle with Fox News is that photo illustrations are at their core. The purpose of them is to provide clarity and a visual context to something that is otherwise difficult to photograph. And so the intent there is to create something, out of the different components of the story that more accurately visually depicts what's happening than you could manage to get a photo of. Fox News used a photo illustration for the exact opposite of that. They said, we want to show this thing that's happening that isn't happening. So we're going to make it happen with a photo illustration. And the reason why they didn't label it as a photo illustration is because they wanted to mislead their audience like they do all the time with their words. So, we can't even talk about this in the same, like the New York Times would just never ever do this. This isn't, and that's not to say that the New York Times is some angel or above critique by no means, but they actually do adhere to journalistic norms, and they really are actually trying to present factual information to their audiences, and that can't be said of Fox News. It just can't. So, while there might be, of course, they're very popular and making a ton of money, so obviously there's a huge audience for their brand of misinformation, but we just can't even have a serious conversation about things like this because it's not indicative of the trend in visual journalism or journalism more generally of how we approach photo illustrations. It's indicative of Fox News's complete incapacity for truth telling. Yeah,
it's like there was the other story that I saw also that was using a photograph, I think, from the George Floyd protests to represent there was a buildings on fire or something like that, and it was being used to represent a Seattle story. It's like that kind of misleading, unethical practices is the reason why Fox News gets the reputation, amongst many other things that we just talked about. But going back to your point about photo illustration, and maybe you can talk about again, what you kind of teach, or either of you can mention, have you had your work used in photo illustration? Have you created photo illustrations yourself? What are your thoughts about the efficacy of using them in general? Do you think there's any sort of perhaps efficacy minefield you might be getting into there? Tara?
I've worked on a few photo illustrations with art directors during my time as a photo editor, and they were primarily integrating graphic elements. So I can't really recall working on a photo illustration that was several photos put together. I remember it being maybe images pulled from a photograph in combination with, added elements. So it was very clear that it was a photo illustration, and it was always clearly labeled as photo illustration. I think that in my career, that's happened so rarely that I would think of it as a footnote. I'm not sure that I even really talk about it too much in my classes, but I can't wait to teach this particular issue in my critical and ethical issues in journalism class. This entire, all of COVID and, or all of coronavirus and the protest movement, this is just magical fodder for the critical journalism classroom.
Have me Skype in on that one.
Oh, I will gladly do that. Zach, don't you threaten me with a good time.
Anytime.
Or Zoom in if you're doing your classes via Zoom, which seems to be the popular thing to do. How about you, Zach? Any use of your imagery or in photo illustration? Any experience with that?
I'm trying to actually look for I think it was the Daily Beast or Southern Poverty Law Center did a really good example of using one of my photos and another photo in a photo illustration. Like I'm literally looking at a Yahoo News story right now where they did things like, so it's an American flag, and then in the background is the Tiki Torch March, those photos, and then three presidential candidates in black and white, contrasted against the color background and that sort of thing. Literally reading Beto O'Rourke, Cory Booker, and Kamala Harris, photo illustration, Yahoo News, photos, AP, Zach Roberts, and Getty, and da-da-da. I don't know why I'm the only one credited, but anyway, I'll take it. But still, again, clearly delineated. I don't know who could possibly ever kind of look at this photo and go, that's one photo. Like, why would three candidates be standing right next to each other, three with microphones? And to me, that's a good way of doing it. I don't necessarily like photo illustrations in general, unless, again, exactly the way you talked about it, is if it's these kind of vague ideas, like we want to use the imagery to kind of get the idea of the far right, far right's marching or something like that, but we don't want to be like, well, this isn't about Charlottesville. This is just about something having to do with the alt-right or whatever. The Tiki Torch March is the thing that everybody in the planet, or at least in America, probably has some idea and some remembrance of. We use that, but we cover it with some other, either we up the contrast to make it so it's not a photojournalistic image. It's art, I guess, and then kind of go from there. Like that I'm okay with. It's been used, like I've had that used a bunch. But like what... I think that even what Fox News did could have been fixed in Photoshop in 10 seconds. You Gaussian blur the background, so it's just a general thing of this is clearly you can see a blockade, and then you can see Seattle or whatever the area behind it, Chaz behind it. Is it Chaz or I forget what it is, but
Chop.
And what's that?
Capitol Hill occupied protest. That's what they're calling it now.
Oh, okay. I'm thinking of a different zone or something like that. The DC one, I guess, is.
It was the autonomous zone. I think they changed names.
I forgot to change it. Yeah. But then put the either up the contrast, put the guy that's in military gear in black and white. Boom! It's a photo illustration. You don't need to do that, but again, it would have at least walked that fine line of some tenet of ethics, which is what Fox News does so often. But again, I don't know why you couldn't just. There's actually photos all around of people with guns in the autonomous zone or whatever it is, the collective now. I don't understand why you couldn't just pull that photo. And in fact, there's Alex Jones is continually far right radio, whatever. Actually, he's not on radio anymore. So, but Lunatic has been ranting about the and the far right has been ranting about there's a African American guy who is taking some level of a leadership role within the area, and he walks around in not in full kit. He doesn't have a helmet on, but he has I think an AR rifle across his chest. There's tons of photos of that. I just don't understand when you have accessible photos that could elicit the same level of like gasp fear that you want from the Fox News. I don't know why you spent the time to do this. That's one of the biggest things about Fox. It's so ridiculous the extent that they'll go to do bad journalism when you could do bad journalism in a way that people get away with all the time.
But they might have to pay more for that to do it that way. There's as I scroll through the Seattle Times coverage or piece on this Fox News photo illustration, something that I think they had done another image, and it's a photo from Minneapolis, I believe, and St. Paul, that illustrated this story about Seattle's Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, called that at the time anyway. And so it's this image of a person running through all of these things on fire. It's a very impactful photo. And they're indicating by, the juxtaposition of that photo and that headline that this is taking place in the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. That is egregious and incredibly dangerous bad journalism. It's not just like a mistake. It's an intentional misdirect for the audience. And I actually think that file photos being used in these ways is a more common and consistent practice across the board in journalism that is incredibly misleading. When I was working as a photo editor during the Ferguson protests, there was a story that the publication I was working with wanted to run about the Ferguson protest being used as a ground for what is the word when you're getting new gang members, as a recruitment ground for gang members. Yeah. And they asked me to pull just random images of Ferguson protesters who had bandanas over their face. And I raised a red flag. I said, we really can't be posting images of these people who are photographed just as protesters in line with we're implying that they are gang members who are either existing gang members or being recruited. And everyone acted as if that was like a ridiculous thing I was saying, as if people don't put the words in the headline and the words in the story together with the image and make assumptions. They're like, well, we'll say in the caption that it's a file photo. Like, that's expecting a level of visual media literacy that we don't actually teach or, produce in our citizens. Sorry. I wish we did.
That sounds like a great case, if it happened, a great case for a libel lawsuit by one of those protesters if they be faced. I have to run, but like the one statement, this is actually something that's like these sorts of things have actually started changing the way that and the choices that I make to upload photos to my wire service. And this is something that's been for a couple of years now that I've seen like one of the biggest issues from Ferguson is you covered it, or not from Ferguson, but from Occupy, you'd cover this entire night of protests. And like right at the end, there'd be some guy that breaks a window and you get a photo of that. That's the photo every single editor, every single person will pull and use as, well, a night of protest turned violent is the worst. Never mind, protests don't turn violent. In my experience, it's usually police decide to start doing violence, and that's never phrased that way. Until recently, I was very proud. I think it was Slate did a piece where like we have to start changing the way they changed the title, where it's like what a police riot happened in Minneapolis or something like that.
But when Slate demands accuracy, they're just called activism and not real journalism. But
exactly. But that's something I deeply worry, not only for my own like safety long term or whatever, but if people continually to see that my photos are being used by news publications to say that these protests are violent and that you have to be worried about Antifa and all these things like that, it endangers me, and also on top of it, understandably people who work in this area would be like, well, why would I allow you to get access to me as a person? Why would I do this? And then on top of it, it's just not true. When you cover 10 hours worth of protest or activism, and then literally one thing happens, and that's the photo to use that do it. I mean, like, I get that that's the attention grabbing thing, but like that's something that deeply worries me about. Like, I know that those photos sell. I can look at what my what my PDF is that I get quarterly from the pay rates, and what are the photos that sell versus what are the photos that don't. The candlelit, simple protest, or the wide shot, so showing how many people were there, they don't sell. The shot of somebody punching somebody in the face or doing whatever, that sells every single time. And then I can see where it's used, and it's not used in stories that are, if the story is just about that incident, then I'm okay with it because it's illustrative of that. But again, it's like, it's not a photo illustration, but it is still manipulating the truth and also summarizing, especially considering most news stories only have one photo if we're lucky, or even worse, don't have a photo involved and just use it to the social media. When you share the link, the link photo, share the link, is what the link photo, you want people to grab your attention. You want people to grab your attention. And those are almost always a lie right out the bat. Like if you look at, again, places like Slate and other places, to use an example, they do that a lot. But a lot of news publications will use that photo to elicit the fear, the clickbaitness, and then move on. But anyway,
and I gotta go, guys. Parts Ron Hamilton joins us.
Great to meet you, Zach.
Good to meet you too.
What is a surprise guest appearance by Mr. Ron Hamilton, freelance. Well, not freelance. You work for, well, I don't know what you would call you, but you do work for a broadcast news agency out of the Philippines, and you're stationed out of Hawaii. So, Mr. Ron Hamilton, how you doing, buddy? Long time no see. Yeah, it's nice when it's like not 3 a.m. in the morning, right? When we do the show, huh? For you. Yeah, if only there was some sort of resource that had answers to these type of questions that you could just ask. But, someday. Or Bing, or DuckDuckGo. I don't know. Anyways, glad to have you with us, Ron. I don't want to retread our first two topics, but any thoughts in general on either... I know you've covered the protests a little bit in Hawaii and whatnot for, your publication. Are you still doing that, or have you moved on to other topics? Yeah. Yeah. Hold on.
Oh. Sorry?
I'm sorry. Start again. I lost you there. Start from the beginning.
Oh. Protests in Hawaii are rare.
Yeah.
They're small. 2,000 people one time in Waikiki. The other daily ones were about 100 people every day in front of the Capitol. I didn't go to last weekend's protest. It was Black Trans Lives Matter in Kaneohe, and I couldn't go to that one.
Okay.
I wanted to go to that one because I wanted to see what population of Hawaii. We have about a couple hundred black people on the island, and then how many of those are trans, I don't know. It must have been a very small protest. I wanted to go check it out, but I didn't go.
Yeah.
That's my protest story.
Okay. All right. Well, let's jump on to our last topic this evening, since we are getting close to the end of our show. I saw this story on Petapixel about building a home studio for cheap, and it's kind of struck a chord with me because I've obviously been doing this podcast for almost 5 years now, and when I started, it was basically a webcam and probably some rando mic that I had lying around. And since then, I've integrated lights and backdrops, and I've got a professional camera that has a direct HDMI feed, and so you see the higher quality image, and I've got a higher quality microphone. So I've built my studio personally over time, and I've spent far more than the $100 that this story says you can build a studio with. Probably if I'd seen this story, or if this has existed back when I started, I probably would have saved myself a lot of money. But it was interesting to see, again, from the perspective that, I've been running this and doing it and improving it over time, and, spending, far more than $100 to make, good video and audio quality for all of you listeners and watchers for this show and other projects that I've done. So it's all kind of, helped out and whatnot. And now with, the sort of the COVID and with everybody being online and everybody having to do essentially video teleconferencing. You see this from, the big celebrities having to do it, YouTube channels essentially from their homes and whatnot. So they've gone from having absolutely just ridiculously low quality, low budget, type of production to now I would say they're slightly above perhaps a teenager in their bedroom quality level. So, they're getting there. But again, building a home studio, I think, is something that, is kind of more relevant in this day and age, and especially being able to do it for a low amount of cost is a nice perk. But, let me throw it over to you, Tara. You do your teaching and stuff like that. You've had to adjust, I would assume, in this COVID world. Are you doing a lot of teaching online?
I was doing quite a bit of teaching online. I'm luckily off the hook for the summer, so able to focus on personal projects and writing and things like that. I haven't really built, I wish I could say that I built a home studio. For example, right now I'm in my, it's kind of a room in our house that is half office, half my daughter's playroom, which is why I'm so oddly positioned, because I don't want you to see the madness that is her nonsense over there. And so I don't really have, our house is 3 adults, 2 cats, a dog, and 2 children. And so when we're all home during this quarantine period, it's been incredibly difficult to kind of find a place to do any sort of video work.
Yeah.
So I sadly can't say that I have created my own home office, but I have found a way to sort of improve my audio, doing Zooms, and
that's good.
Also found a few spaces in the house that work that are preferable for doing Zoom online classes with my students, essentially.
Yeah, no, I was going to ask if there had been any consideration about that, because I'm sure, obviously we all hope things will resume to a sense of normalcy next semester, right? When the school resumes, that you can still go to an actual building and see people in person. But, if worse comes to worse and you have to continue doing these calls and doing the Zoom stuff and online training, is there any sort of consideration where you might want to up your game, so to speak, with regard to video quality, or even taking audio quality further, or backdrops? Is that something like that you consider for the next semester, or do you think you'll keep things the same?
I will definitely be getting a mic. As you know, we had some audio issues, and that's been fairly consistent and incredibly frustrating. Just trying to find the right combination of headphones and my laptop being in the mood to give me the audio that I need. But I have definitely also been thinking about putting up a backdrop, because I think just, trying to negotiate the sort of lighting situations in the spaces of my house, it would be much easier if I just created that space myself.
Yeah.
And since this is what I do, of course I can do that. It might be a bit of a pain in the ass in terms of sort of putting it up, taking it down. So I'm still thinking through the logistics of that.
Yeah.
But I do intend to make some kind of sort of digital classroom space. Also, it would be productive for me, so that I tend to teach by writing on the board a lot and engaging with my students in that sort of chalk talk way. And so I've been trying to think about, how do I bring that into the Zoom classroom, which I did not achieve by any means towards the end of last semester, when we were just sort of thrown online. But thinking ahead, that is something that I would like to do for my students.
Yeah, and absolutely.
This coming year.
And it's been great to see different camera manufacturers embracing sort of the current events by enabling their cameras to be able to stream or present video directly from the camera. It's something that we knew they were all capable of, but it seems like they never got around to enabling it. Even my GH5, my 3-year-old camera, they just recently allowed the capability to stream from it from USB. It's not great. It won't replace what I'm currently using, but it is nice to see that. And that's the thing that I got from this video, is that with just a few simple items, and with just some basic understanding of how your camera gear works and using aperture, I would highly recommend everybody use a DSLR, use an actual camera for your webcam. It makes so much difference visually versus like a webcam. And that's again, something that can be done for, relatively cheap, especially since most people already have the camera. Like, what are you shooting with, Tara? What's your daily driver? And I lost your audio.
I muted myself. My apologies.
No worries.
No, I'm right here. I have a 5D Mark IV, and I also have a Canon C100 that I shoot with when I'm.
So I believe both those cameras have HDMI out, and those could be used if you, again, depending on what your level of desire is, you could take those and, connect that up directly to your computer and use it as a webcam, throw on a nice shallow depth of field lens. You get a nice shallow depth of field when you're talking to folks. It really increases the quality. I think the biggest thing I saw was the lighting, his ability to use just a few simple, inexpensive LED lights and get a really nice lighting setup was pretty amazing. Ron, you're of course using the highest of production quality for your office home video stream. I do have to say I'm glad to see the computer on a stable surface, the camera on a stable surface. That's an upgrade, and it's at eye level. So thank you for that. Obviously, Ron, you're doing a lot of stuff for your broadcast corporation, so it has to have a level of quality with regard to what they can broadcast. Are you doing anything either in your home, or do you just kind of do everything? I know you do. You can go on your porch and get a nice, beautiful vista of Hawaii for the stand-ups. But are you doing anything with lighting or whatnot, backdrops to help allow you to do that more from your home?
I do own all those things you mentioned. I don't use them very often.
Yeah.
It's pretty rare. If I'm on location and if I'm doing a commercial type thing with models or something, yeah. But as far as like for news stuff or even for my stand-ups, no, I do that here on my balcony most of the time.
Right.
If we're doing a story on Hawaii, we got Waikiki right here. I just do like that, as you saw when you visited.
Indeed.
So no, I don't have to do that. As far as lighting goes, I do have some lights that I have used sometimes to light my face if it's a dark night and or bright light. Anyway, whatever the case. Yeah, I have used lights before. Typically, I don't have to. And the other thing is, when I'm shooting on my balcony, if it's just a stand-up, I'm usually got my cell phone on a tripod, and it does a good job with the HDR, and it does just fine. And I can do like that. If I'm in the field, I'm using a real camera, and I'm not setting up a studio in the field now.
Yeah. Have you? I know you're doing. Obviously you have the things that you do. That require people to be in touch with one another. Have you been embracing sort of the Zoom culture, the online sort of presence with some of the things you've been doing? I know you don't teach, but you do other sort of teaching type activities.
Yeah, no, I'm not teaching on the internet or anything. No, I do that when I'm in the Philippines. I give seminars.
Okay.
Like that, my students out there, and I keep in touch with them. But it's not like teaching classes.
Right.
Like what Tara's up to. I'm not doing that kind of thing right now. As far as the Zoom, we have our meetings. We had it by Zoom. They got nervous about Zoom hackers, so we switched to another service. I don't recall. We use something else now for our meetings. But then, as far as the stories go, in fact, even the live broadcast we were doing, I'm not involved in that either right now. I just do packages.
Yeah.
But for the guys that do the live, they do it over Zoom.
Oh wow. Okay.
If they just call on them or whatever they're using right now, whatever, I can't remember what it is anymore. But they just call them up. Okay, you're on next. Get ready, and then they do their report, and then they move on to the next guy.
Yeah. I've considered using Zoom for this platform, but it costs money, especially if you want longer than 40-minute conversations. And I just. Skype gets the job done. I'm not hosting 100 people live at the same time, so Skype gets the job done. All right. Well, I think that's gonna. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say that I wish more than anything I had bought stock in Zoom. 4 months ago.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I took advantage of that back when all this started. I heard about them, so I haven't looked at my stock recently, but I'm sure it's gone up. But you're always wondering, like, when's the time to kind of pull out of a stock, because it's like things are starting to sort of get back to normal. By this time next year, will it be as popular because people are back in school or whatever? So I don't know, but yeah.
Well, I think what you want to do is buy stock in the next. There's absolutely a startup happening right now that's trying to reimagine Zoom, how to make Zoom better for the millennial set, with looking at all the problems that we've seen happen during this shift to online.
Yeah.
And so whatever that thing is, that's the one we want to buy stock in, probably.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, I think that's going to bring us to the end of this week's show. I want to thank you so much, Tara, for taking time out to be on here and talk about everything you're doing. Where can people find Where can people find out about more about you and your work?
Well, absolutely, my website, which is www.tarapixley.com. I don't think we need to say the www anymore. But tarapixley.com, and also @tlpix is my Instagram. You can check me out on Twitter @tlpix. I don't talk there as much as I'm now engaging on my Instagram. So would love to chat with people and engage in the ideas of the day, and also have you take a look at my work. Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, thank you for being on. Truly appreciate it. And have everybody go give Tara your time and check out her work. Ron, anything going on in your world we need to know about, or anything coming up that you want to share?
Shout out to Hannah Kozak, former podcast guest.
Yeah.
She got me hooked on the Fuji system now.
Oh.
I've traded my Fuji. Yeah.
Wow.
Big news in the Hamilton household here, and it's all because of Hannah. It's not because of Sharky James.
Mm-hmm.
It's not because of Pete Souza.
Mm-hmm.
It's not because of Ibarian X. All these Fuji shooters. Because of them, it was Hannah Kozak.
Wow.
Before her, this is a camera for hipsters. This is for guys that I don't care. I'm not interested. And she totally sold me. I didn't think I ever would be, but she's right. So now I got my new. I didn't buy an XT4. I didn't buy an XT. I bought an XT2 because I wasn't too sure about this thing. But I got my 16 to 55, and I got my 50 to 140, and magic. What a great system.
Great. So
thank you, Hannah.
Yeah, there we go. All right, awesome. All right, well, you can find out more about everything we talked about tonight and every platform that we publish on by going to aroundthelens.com. You'll find links to all of our social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, all that fun stuff there. In addition to this episode's show notes, so you can see the websites that we were talking about and kind of see what we were talking about there in more detail. Furthermore, if you'd like to support the show financially, please go to patreon.com/aroundthelens. Donate as little as $1 a month and get everything we produce ahead of time. I'm working on a few Around the Lens commentaries I plan to post there soon, so be on the lookout for that. And again, if you'd like to support visual journalism, what we're doing here, it's truly appreciated. But of course, in this times, that's not just watching the show, sharing it with friends, liking, commenting, subscribing. That's all great and all we really ask for. So truly appreciate it in any way you can do that. Continue the conversation online. We want to know, do you agree with what we're saying? Do you disagree? Go into Facebook and write in the comments section below this post and let me know. Duly appreciate hearing from the audience. All right. Well, Tara, thank you so much again for taking time out. Truly appreciate it. You're always welcome back on the show. So for Ron Hamilton and Tara Pixley, I'm David J. Murphy. This has been Around the Lens, episode 230, and we are out.
Thanks for listening to Around the Lens. We hope you enjoyed the show. To continue the conversation, head on over to one of our social media outlets such as Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or Twitter. To support the show financially, consider donating to us via Patreon. For show notes from this week's episode and links to everything else we talked about, just go to our website, aroundthelens.com. Finally, if you or someone you know might be a good guest for the show, get in touch with us via email at info@aroundthelens.com.